Welcome to the Belgrade. Game 3, Day 2. Hans Niemann versus Jan Nepomniachtchi. Last day marked quite intense games, specifically the games 2, where Jan Nepomniachtchi had completely winning position, pressing against Hans Niemann, and on the end of the day, Hans managed to hold it and secure the half point in the second game. The results: first game, Nepomniachtchi won. Second one, it was a draw. The total result currently is in favor for Jan Nepomniachtchi, 1.5 points, and for the Hans Niemann, half point. Today we have different playing home. As you might notice, already we have members in audience. Game starts in a couple of minutes. It's a morning round here in Europe. The match is about to begin. And here comes the NEPO. He's the one that is taking the white pieces in this game.
Game starts in 1 minute.
I just want to check with a chat. Do you hear me well? Is everything goes smooth? The stream? Great. Morning rounds are always tough for every single chess player. Doesn't matter as a top GM or 2000 level player. With quality is garbage. I completely agree with you. But hopefully the next day we're gonna make it happen. It will get better. It's just temporary. And the game started. NEPO opened with c4. He chooses the English. Hans potentially did not expect NEPO to open with the 1c4. NEPO is usually e4 type of player, but I would say that NEPO wants to get long game, fighting game, without deep theoretical lines in Ring Lopez or Italian game, as we already saw in the first game, where actually NEPO won that beautiful Ring Lopez. And Hans responds with symmetrical English. Who won that game yesterday? Is there somewhere I can watch it back? There is game on YouTube channel. Type Hans Niemann in the search and you'll find both games in live segment on the channel. NEPO is leading with 1.5 against Hans with half points. And we have 4 knights English. It'll be a very big fighting game. d4 happened on the board. Hans took on d4. As we already know, we have this experimental time control 60 plus 30. without increment after 40th move, without time control, but increment is 30 seconds after each move for the rest of the game. Their combined auras are disrupting the video feed signal. I can agree on that. For the new viewers, I will turn on the point segment. So NEPO is leading the match, while HANS is a little behind, but we still have 6 games, 3 more days. Big fight, big match here in Belgrade. NEPO chooses to go for g3 to put the bishop on that beautiful square for the rest of the game. As we already know, this could become very strong bishop that always makes problems. Middle game, end game, doesn't matter. We are still in the sort of theoretical line here because both of them are blitzing out the moves. NEPO is drinking coffee as well, or maybe tea. On the other side, HANS is taking a sip of water. Both of them are calculating potential outcome of this opening that they're having on the board. And already there is a good amount of audience members. The match is actually very intense. Early game, I completely agree. Even in Europe, in US, America, I would say it's already 5, 6, 4 in the morning. Cheers, guys. Tight whitey shirt. Yep. We want to be as much as professional here. d5. HANS is not waiting for anything. He is striking the center. As after c takes d5, he takes d5 here, we would get isolated pawn in the middle, which is usually providing quite imbalanced game, where black is looking to keep the tension on the board without trading so much pieces, while on the other side, white is looking to simplify as much as he can, because usually, as we know, in the isolated pawn structure, what benefit white has is the long-term target on the d5 pawn in all these Queen's Gambit systems. And also, since this came from the English and the bishop is on g2, it's a little bit different because we didn't play yet the move e3. So pretty much NEPO has to get this developed. And also we have e takes d5 on the board. It's a good thing that HANS is getting this bishop out, and he actually decides to exchange on c3. It's usually not good to give the bishop away that early in the game, but there is a big purpose because he is simply ruining the pawn structure, and the c3 as well as d5 are both soft pawns for the rest of the game. But d5 in this case is more pleasant because it's also restricting the bishop on g2. While on the other side, NEPO has the open b line, so most probably he might place the rook on b1, but on the other side, if the bishop comes on f5, this square will be taken by Hans Niemann. And as well, this pawn might look weak, but on the other side, this pawn is perfectly restricting the knight on c6. It means that it's also stabilizing the square on d4. But as we already know, when you have the target, the isolating here, IQP, if you want to win that pawn, you need to provide a center pressure. So it's not enough just to plant the knight there. Many people would make mistake and place the knight here and keep him for the rest of the game. At some point, you need to move that knight. Very famous commentator Daniel Naroditsky, who passed away last year, mentioned in a lot of his speedruns that you cannot just use this square and keep your pieces forever here. Eventually you need to move the pieces from that square and strike that pawn at some point. You forgot to set the anti-flicker settings that you screenshotted yesterday. I did not forget. I actually changed it, and this is the best I can do. For some reason, it's still glitching. I'll try to fix it for the next game. But this is the only thing that is, let's say, unfixed. So we have to fix. This is the only thing. Everything else works, and the quality of camera for tomorrow will be better because we changed the playing hole today. And tomorrow we're gonna get to the same playing hole that we were yesterday, where we're gonna make the quality better for the footage also. If I put, let's say, the wide camera for them, now it's good, but it depends on the connection because the link is transferring the footage from the laptop to here. It's not on cable, unfortunately, but it's only today. Tomorrow we're gonna have better quality, and the flaking thing is the only thing that's not fixed. So yeah, and we see here Hans actually castled, and Nepo is trying to remember potentially some lines that he prepared, or he's thinking about what could possibly arise in this position. I don't believe that Nepo is out of his preparation. I think that he just thinks about what could possibly come. On the other side, I feel that Hans is quite relaxed what he got on the board. I think he likes his position. If there is mods, if there is contributors in the chat, I would like you to create a poll about something so we can interact more with the audience. Thank you very much. This playing hole is much better than yesterday's one. I completely agree. It's just about a schedule with the residents there playing the match. We don't have anything to do with that. Is this where Bobby Fischer played? Yeah, this match is also together trying to, let's say, remake or replay the match Spassky Fischer that was held exactly in the same building many years ago. So yeah, that's true. Will Hans do a post-game interview today? Hopefully yes. We are trying to bring him inside, but remember that there is immediately the game after this one. Currently now it's 10 in the morning in Europe. The next game is starting 2:30. It means that they don't have so much time and they need to rest for the next game. Also take some snack, lunch, and so on. Are these games ELO rated? Yeah. And again, we see Nepo taking the break immediately after a few moves in the game. And he played a move bishop g5. It's quite a nice move, putting the pressure on the knight on f6. Generally speaking, these positions are on the high level. It's quite hard to lose as top GM because they're very straightforward. You have certain weaknesses. The first one is on d5, the second one might be on b7. When you apply the pressure with the rook on b1, you also have the knight on b3. Black has to be conscious of how he pushes this pawn, because once he pushes, he leaves the weaknesses on this diagonal. And also, this pawn can get extended. So what Hans will try now, I believe, is to bring this knight to the better square, maybe on c4, just to replace the... Like knight would be actually very good on b6. If the knight is on b6, there'll be such a huge pressure already on c line for Hans. But knight on c6 looks good, but it could get restricted for the rest of the game if he remains there, because this pawn is doing a great job. And now after this pin, I would say, let's say maybe h6 is potentially what Hans tried to force the trade here and simply give this pawn away, while on the other side Hans will get this pawn on c3. And with this, technically speaking, we have imbalanced structures, 4 versus 3. On the other side, 2 versus 1. And what is usually White trying to do is somehow to win 2 pawns and give this one away, and to stay with 4 versus 3 in certain endgame. And actually we have that on the board. Hans played h6, we are seeing most probably bishop takes f6, then after queen takes f6, queen takes d5, queen takes e3, this will come. And in this position, maybe Nepo will play something slow like e3, because that's useful move, putting the pawn on the light square, taking the d4 square. Also, as usual, this rook is pleasant to stay on the e line. Certainly now, because the d line is open, it will come here for sure. So Nepo has a beautiful fianchetto together with this bishop on g2 and these structures, while on the other side Hans will definitely have some press already along the d line. So if rook d8 happens, we'll put a queen on some square, maybe queen h5 or something. Maybe queen h5 is actually not the best idea, I believe so, because queen belongs on the queen side, putting the pressure on b7, not giving development for this bishop. We didn't get winning interviews yesterday. What do you mean by that? We got Nepo on the end after the draw. Really have tough deciding for who should I be rooting for. I always enjoy watching both of them whenever they play. Me too. Did Niemann win game 2 yesterday or no? No, it was a draw. He actually saved the game, which is actually good. And we got queen takes d5, everything we mentioned happening on the board. And queen takes e3. Where now after there is options for Nepo, he can also play rook from f to c1. Queen can come on b2, putting the pressure along the second rank. Let's say e3, bishop e6, quite natural move, queen comes to b5 again. Maybe just defending the pawn is enough. If this bishop would stand on c8, guys, then we would have beautiful just capture on c6 here, where after this rook will be hanging, so that's why we have to defend the pawn now. On the other side, Nepo has to be careful here, because, for example, taking this guy on c6 looks like a good idea, but it's actually not. You're giving up your best minor piece on the board, which not just creates the opportunities on this diagonal, it also gives the safety for the king. So now after trading this bishop, we simply don't have defender and protector for our king for the rest of the game, and that's actually what Nepo has to be conscious about. I would say that after queen takes e6 here, definitely there is rook bc8, and we are about to see winning position for Hans, because after bishop takes b3, Nepo is not in time to recapture because rook on c1 is simply hanging, so this is the first issue for white here. Queen c5 is, or any queen move just not taking this pawn is better one, but we have a lot of simplicity now here, and we got again the same idea from yesterday. As you remember in the yesterday games, there is there was two bishops versus two knights. Now we have bishop versus knight, and still this is the case where bishop favors the knight. Why? It's simply because we have many pawn islands and we have potential play on two flanks, and usually bishop is better piece. On the other side, there is another thing that NEPO should be careful here, and that's the light squares. So not just that he's striking the pawn on a2, it's also putting the pressure along this diagonal where Hans would have a lot of chances for the checkmate patterns. Taking on c6 is never good. It's just about what NEPO prefers here and what he likes to do. Is it directly harassing the queen? On the other side, if you go rook a bc1 here, then you're going to simply maybe lose the pawn on e2 or on a2, so you have to defend yourself first and then go and strike. Yeah, I believe that Hans has a very easy game because he understands that he doesn't really mind giving up pawns just to get attention of this bishop. Like, he wants to take down the bishop on g2. That's what he would prefer in this position. The stream's rating increased by 400 points. Can you explain your comment? By quality of the stream, I would say so. Hello Eleyah, and thank you for bringing us this match. Hello guys, and welcome for the new viewers. For those who just joined us, we have the scoreboard here. NEPO is leading the match, but there is still 6 rounds to go, 3 fantastic days, fantastic weekend in Belgrade here, and we are looking for the most exciting games today. Here is the playing hall, the players, the audience, and the view is just beautiful. On the board we got the move Queen to c5, which NEPO chooses because he prefers the endgame part. Why? Because, as I mentioned earlier, if we would have the trade here, let's say knight takes c5, then simply these rooks will come on, one will come on, let's say, on b1, the other one will come on c1, and if NEPO manages to take down these two pawns and just give the one on this side, then he will get the endgame 4 versus 3 on the king side, and this is quite unpleasant to defend, especially in this time format where players after 30 moves in the game usually don't have enough time on the clock. There is no time control. Time format is 60 plus 30 without additional time after the 40th move. So experimental time control that we got recently because of the new format and new ideas that are coming in the chess world. Specifically, in this position after queen to c5, Hans can bring the queen back, of course. Can also put on b2, create a pressure on the e2 square, of course. But on the other side, when the queen is staying on f6, it's also controlling this and also remaining on this diagonal. But as mentioned earlier, Hans doesn't mind giving up for NEPO this bishop, since this bishop is quite a strong piece. Let's say here, maybe NEPO will play something like e3. This looks quite natural. Maybe bishop to f5 will come in the game. And then just bring the pieces like rook fd1, rook from a to c8. We have very nice battle, maybe rook d6. But these positions are getting quite tactical sooner or later, because also this knight, together with this bishop, together with this queen, they can create some certain patterns on the king side. And that's something what NEPO is aware of. He compensate a bit of a structure if he would play the move e3 for safety in the dark squares, but then light squares could become vulnerable. On the other side, he has pleasant endgame because his pawn chain is having more pawns, and when you have pawn chain that is stable, like NEPO's pawn chain with the 4 pawns, while on the other side Hans has 3 pawns in the pawn chain, that's usually better for the endgame. and this pawn here is fighting against 2. So queen f6 on the board, actually what we recommended. Taking on c6 is possible idea, but I believe for the practice, maybe actually this is something what NEPO will decide to do if he wants pure simplicity. But generally, what about this diagonal? In the future, playing f3 looks like that's the move, and that's the idea that could defend for temporary part of the game. But on the other side, I guess later you want to push even e4. That opens up the second rank, not just the first rank. So I believe that maybe NEPO will postpone this idea. He will not simplify that much. He would most probably play slowly here, bring the rooks to the game like this, while the Hans Niemann will pretty much do the same stuff with bishop f5. Yeah, he does rook from f to d1. Quite expected move here. Did they put any pool in the chat? This commentator blows St. Louis Chess Club's live streams out of water. I believe that they have one of the best live streams in chess generally. Like, Peter Svidler is one of the best commentators that I ever watched. I remember once he was commentating the Singfun Cup, maybe 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And I was just sitting for the whole day in my room, watching it for 5-6 hours from beginning to the end. Like, it was so amazing. When he's standing in the board, like, and showing the moves, explaining the ideas, not just the opening sound, but everything, such a good narrative. What is wrong with 60 plus 30? There is nothing wrong. I believe this is actually quite a good format. And we have rook fd1 on the board. Okay, that's the move that I already played. Generally, time is quite nice. Management is good for Hans. We can remember from yesterday that Hans Niemann had a lot of problems managing the time. Maybe he was adapting on the time control that we have in this match. Or maybe he lacked confidence. We'll ask him after the stream, eventually, to see if there's anything that he was struggling yesterday, because we noticed that he was not in the best shape. I don't agree with chat. I think Yasser is actually very good commentator as well. Current score for the viewers that just joined us. Can again showing the points board. NEPO is leading the match, but there is 6 more rounds, of course, for the rest of this weekend and on Monday at the same time frame as we are doing the first match and the first game. Directly from the playing hall, they got a bunch of drinks on the table, we can notice. Coffee, water. They have behind them snacks and so on. The idea for white in this endgame is to exchange the queens. That's the most comfortable thing that white can get here, and he will immediately get significant practical advantage for this endgame, where of course Black is refusing that and he is trying to complicate even more. Bishop g4 is the move that I potentially like here, where after we can see this idea and now the move f3. So he wants to firstly exchange this bishop and then to play the move f3, because if you go the opposite direction, playing the move f3 directly will definitely make the problems in the future for this bishop. Let's say something bishop to e6, and then if you want to get even e4 on the board, you have to be really careful to not ruin the king safety. There is many people in the chat, I believe so, that would like to get this type of pawn moves here, but this is actually very wrong strategy here, because this is not about any kingside attack, this is not about a checkmate, this is strictly about positional grind on the queen side of the board. So I believe after f4, e5, temporarily it will look potentially good for white because he's getting this massive pawn chain, but in practice this is actually what Hans would like to see from NEPO. And NEPO is of course aware of that this is something that he can't really do, but this bishop g4 move would be a very nice provocation for NEPO to decide to take on c6 and then to go for this idea after ruining the pawn structure of Hans on the queen side. Let's say bishop to e6, and still e4 here won't be a very bad move, because now in this case bishop on g2 is not there and he's losing the pawn, so he has to protect it, maybe king to f2, and this looks safe on the first glance, but in the future it might get in a problem, because I believe that now Hans could get everything on the e line and start putting the pressure on this pawn, forcing at some point NEPO to start moving these pawns up. Of course here it doesn't work because this pawn is pinned, obviously, but if he managed to protect them, and he wants again to exchange the queens because he wants to provide a king safety. If NEPO wants to push the kingside pawns, he needs a trade of queens. Once the queen trade happens, this is going to get pushed, and NEPO will definitely get these pawns up. But before that, he needs to play strictly on the queen side board here, half of the board. Greetings to Macedonia. This match is organized by Endgame AI. Hans is of course one of the organizers. He's organizing match for himself, obviously, because he's the owner of Endgame AI, the founder. And match is held in Belgrade, where Spassky and Fischer had the World Championship match back in 20th century in the same residency of Hyatt in Belgrade. This is some information, and we got bishop takes e6. So NEPO actually decided to give up his light square bishop, which is big thing eventually. He's relying on that endgame, we can say. Many people ask in chat, did he drop the pawn here? But after pawn takes here, queen takes here, there is some compensation for black here. As I mentioned earlier, this bishop was the key role defender for the king on g1. So we might get something like rook a c8 or rook f c8 here, start putting some pressure on these lines here, and eventually, despite you have the pawn up on the king side here, you can't really use that pawn. This pawn will never become passer. So as I mentioned earlier, NEPO is relying on the long run, the long endgame that can make this pawn run and get the beautiful pass pawn. But the problem is that Hans will not allow the trade after this. He might get the trouble for him on the king side by putting the pressure on these light squares. I believe so that in this position, not necessarily rook from a to d8 should be played. Maybe rook from a to c8 could be a better idea. Let's say NEPO will still press his pawn structure. And now directly going for the second rank here. Looks like a possible one, but there is beautiful move 94 that pretty much kicked this rook back, or putting him on b2 at least, but also defending here and putting the pressure on the bishop on e6. So that's why this strategy is not the best. Maybe queen to e5 could be considerable to put a pressure on e2. So if they take on a7, then queen in the future could take this pawn here. So this is already 2 pawn sacrifice, but after bishop takes b3, pawn takes b3, and queen takes c2, this pawn structure is more vulnerable for the king safety than the pawn structure of the king, because king will go more distance from the area of the center on h7, while after some first rank check, king will go closer, because g line for beginners is closer than the h line. On the other side, that's the circumstances of giving up this bishop, but what NEPO is relying in this position is to maintain exactly this pawn structure without giving up this e2 pawn and keeping the game as long as possible. I would not say that this game will be easy draw, because there is a lot of stuff going on here. The game is eventually not that simple to conclude that this is going to be a draw, because I already see the imbalances here with bishop versus knight, plus weak squares here. Bishop is technically better playing on the 2 wings. King really feels lonely here, J1, I would say. So I don't believe that this position is close to be a draw. So you maybe ask now why Hans is spending some time here. It's because he doesn't need directly to take this bishop. He can firstly pin that bishop by rook fc8 or rook ac8. Or he can technically also take on b3 and then take on c6 if he wants to purely defend this position, like bishop takes, pawn takes, queen c6, takes, and eventually this position will be complete draw. If Hans wants to do this, he'll just go for that, because maybe if he wants to take a draw, this position will pretty much end up in a draw sooner or later, because Hans will take b3, NEPO will take c6, or a pawn doesn't really matter, and then they would have 4 versus 4. It's not that much imbalance, and this will end up most probably in a drawing position. While on the other side, Hans can keep playing it and go with a f rook, let's say on c8, because he wants to keep the a7 pawn, so this rook has to stay here. And let's say here then, actually now I'm thinking, it's something like, oh, this is actually crazy. Bishop takes b7, rook takes c5, knight takes c5, rook to b8, knight takes e6, queen takes e6, and let's say bishop to after. This position is apparently still level, but it's very imbalanced. Why is this level? Why is this not better for black? It's because that even with a queen here on the board, queen is not enough to counterplay the rook, pawn, and the bishop. Bishop is providing always safety for the e2 and for the king, so king will be safe on g2. The rooks are very powerful together with this bishop, and that's why this can end up actually also in this way. But queen is a queen, and of course NEPO will not go for this queen sacrifice. On the other side, NEPO might just play queen d4 here, which is technically maybe the easiest way to offer the queen trade. Queen takes d4 will be mistake for Hans Niemann, because after this and this, now suddenly this pawn structure is actually not good for Hans. The previous one was good, the rook endgame, but now he has just so many pawn islands, which potentially Jan can slightly press in this endgame where Hans has chances to hold, but it's already getting quite unpleasant for Niemann in this situation. I believe that after rook d6, he might have a lot of trouble here. So I believe that Niemann will see this and not enter this type of position to exchange the queens on d4. Of course, you might just take on c6, ruining the pawn structure on the king side. But for players who are questioning why we ruin the pawn structure, you have to understand that in endgames, pawn structure matters only if the pawns doesn't have support of each other's or pieces. Like you can have the shutter pawns, but sometimes these pawns are actually providing more stability than the normal pawn structure. Let me explain. Eventually here, you can notice that this is 4 versus 3, and if we just clear the board and leave this pawn structure, it's very hard to create any sort of pass pawn from this 4 against this 3. But if you take a look at this position, technically speaking, if you bring the pawn to e6, then this is a passer, right? But if you have the position that we just analyzed here, it's not possible to create a passer because you need to create another pawn that can strike these double pawns. So this is actually a very nice position for black if you want to grind this endgame. Rook c2 might come, and also we can see the proven point why bishop is technically better, potentially better than the knight in this endgame, specifically because Hans can get these 2 pawns going up against this one, and once he creates a pass pawn, and once he on the other side puts the pressure on the king side, this could get unpleasant for NEPO. What is the score? So I guess there's many viewers just joined. Let's take a look again. NEPO won the first game, while on the other side we had a draw in the yesterday afternoon game where unbelievably Hans held that middle game with very good advantage for NEPO. On the end, NEPO joined the stream and we had some interview where he explained that position was not that much simple, but it was very tough, and on the first glance obvious that NEPO was completely winning, but it was always Hans defending that position. So this is current score. There is 6 games to go, and with 3 more days on the board. NEPO taking the break, going for a walk. On the board, we still have bishop c6 because Hans is thinking what to choose. Because I believe that this is a crucial moment for Hans. He has 2 options. One option is to keep the game going by, let's say, putting the rook from f to c8, or just taking on b3 and simply exchanging everything here. Where I believe that NEPO will not refuse and go with queen f5 or something. I believe NEPO will go for the maximum simplicity, and the draw could be agreed very soon after this rook endgame. I believe there is nothing much that any of these players can do here, as my rook endgame knowledge probably agrees on that. I believe that b3 pawn will fall and then any other pawn here will get down. But of course, if he technically got on the board 4 versus 3, this position is of course equal according to machines, but in practice we've seen some ideas how white can try to play for the win, and specifically if he managed to bring all these pawns up. Like if white manages to bring the pawns on f4, g4, h5 and e5 and suddenly bring the king here and black just doesn't do anything and waits for it, then white will be winning. This is the famous position. You can find many courses online in all famous books about Dvoretsky. Sam Shankland has beautiful book on the rook endgames together with other many courses about this. This position is known as a draw, but there is ideas how white can press for the win. Of course, Hans will not wait for white's pawn to get up, and the beautiful start, how you can get some tension if you're in the move in that pawn endgame. You have just these pawns against these pawns on the board, and let's say 1 rook on each side. technically, let's just make this position somehow. It's useful to interact with that. For example, let's suddenly put the rook here, let's say, then rook from f to b8. Let's say he wins this pawn, then this guy wins this pawn. Suddenly he brings this rook back. Then he just, I don't know, let's say waits. We change one rook. Suddenly attacks the pawn. He blunders the pawn or something. He takes the pawn, and we got this position. So this endgame is, of course, a drawing endgame. And the way how black should defend is to play g6 and h5. As far as I know, the best try for white is to start here with a move g4. Why? Because he's immediately taking control over the h5 and f5 at the same time. And he's not allowing Hans to get g6 and h5. I think this is the best try. If there's any grandmaster in the chat, you can correct me. But I think this is one of the best tries. Of course, Hans could play here something like this and then just push g6 and he will hold everything. And that's it. Like, not to prevent h5, but to play it, to get some space, because eventually white's idea is to push these pawns as far as he can. Like this, if he gets this structure, then white might be winning in some scenarios. So that's why. Otherwise, like this is, for example, if f4, e5, then g6, h5 are enough to hold everything, and r2 will be fine. And we have the b takes e6 actually. So Hans finally decide to take that bishop. I'm 800 Elo, I can correct you. Yes, sure. So now NEPO is thinking most probably, okay, I was just about to suggest that move. And also rook d6, but knight e4 seems to be more smooth because it's directly putting the pressure on this bishop. Let's say bishop to d5 is the move that many players would play here, but maybe this is something what NEPO wants. Because now at this point, he wants to get f3, so close this bishop eventually, and then slowly start improving the position by going, let's say, rook to d2, then bring the other rook to c1, so he's simply taking the control over the first and second rank, putting the pressure on c6 on the other side. Maybe at some point he can get e4, but I believe that he has to get conscious about leaving the f3 pawn unprotected and opening up more the king. So preferably, I would keep the king closed. Maybe f3 is the maximum. I would push this pawn, and then later, depends on the potential trading on the board, we would get other moves with a pawn such as e4. On the other side, I don't know if it's a certain idea, but if you play f3, will it be possible for Hans to go a bit crazy and go start pushing g5, h5 and storm the king side, which eventually gives some good chances to exploit on the light squares together with that strong bishop on d5. So knight e4 is actually quite challenging move, asks a lot of questions. Still Hans can go for rook fd8, just ignores everything, where we can just get this on the board and eventually we would be not happy to see quite fast draw in this position, which I believe with this structure Hans is trying to maintain the bishop, while the other side, NEPO, is pushing and putting the bishop d7. Bishop d7 on the board. So this is a little bit unexpected, if you ask me. Now bishop becomes quite passive, but on the other side, as I mentioned earlier, for the isolated pawns, this knight on d4 is good looking piece, but eventually it's outshined by the bishop and the pawn on c6, so knight cannot make any progress. And to do something on the e line, you have to eventually move this knight from that square. So to maybe replace it on e5, let's say, or to bring it back to b3 and then to go a5, like we've seen recently in the first game of yesterday match. On the other side, Hans will try to enter through the b line and also to put some pressure on the e pawn, which provokes again Nepo to push this pawn, which shatters more the king side and safety. Let's go in the chat. Who roots for Nepo? Who roots for Hans? Type 1 for Hans, type 2 for Nepo. Let's see who has more fans and audience and supporters. Again, many people ask what is the scoreboard here. We can pull out it again. So Nepo is leading the match with just 1 point lead, but we're gonna have 6 more games here. So stay tuned, guys, to watch the rest of the match tomorrow and Monday, the same time as today, and after the game starts, also at 2:30 Central Europe time. Bishop d7 on the board. So I don't really want Hans to make the passive position again, but I can understand his idea, because eventually, if he managed to bring this rook and controls properly the b line, and the other rook to control the e line, then Nepo might be in a trouble, because this knight temporarily looks much better than the bishop on d7, and we can all agree on that. But potential problems could arise in seconds, where Hans could get, let's say, rook on second rank, the other rook provoke the e pawn to get pushed, and suddenly the checkmate patterns appears here. So that's actually questionable. Also, the rook can come on e5 and then get shifted and lifted along the 5th rank, where the queen gets interrupted. So I don't know how Nepo could start this position. Maybe rook d2 is pleasant option. Let's say rook from f to e8. Maybe rook to c1 looks natural here, putting the pressure on c6, and then suddenly something like rook e5, with eventually the idea of just putting the rook somewhere on the 5th rank in the future. Queen comes somewhere back. I don't know if queen c4 makes sense here. Just keeping the pressure. Maybe queen c3 is actually more convenient because it's on the dark square, just escaping any bishop problem. And now something like rook to d5, putting the pressure on this knight and eventually provoking this type of move, because this opens up the light squares. So this is one idea. Or after rook to d2, maybe Hans can try this, but the problem is the a7 pawn is always saying it. So once you play this move, it gives the option for NEPO just to take that pawn, and you can try to generate some initiative, but you don't have threats yet. So I don't think this is the best option that Hans will pick. Or maybe he'll try firstly with a5 and then a4, and then he'll try to push this pawn as much as he can just to get him as close as possible to the first rank where the promotion in the future could happen, to leave the dark square dark. And we have on the board, after bishop d7, NEPO chooses to bring the rook from a to c1. We were discussing rook to d2. Rook to ac1 is a very natural move, threatening the pawn on c6, but we already mentioned a couple of times that this pawn on c6 is eventually, in many cases, poison pawn, because taking that pawn requires a lot of courage about giving up the diagonal that could arise in the future and create some problems for the king, and also opening the c line, also softening the e2 once you move your knight, and this creates some threats like rook from f to e8. And for example, if you take on c6, Hans would be more than happy just to start pressing with bishop g4, just taking this pawn and getting to this endgame where he can go for the draw. And this is absolutely equal position, because most probably we're gonna get nice safety for the Hans. He'll defend this pawn properly. On the other side, NEPO will try to make the double attack, but after something like this, let's say, you might give one check, or he can just play rook to c7 here and defend the pawn, and that's it. We have another drawish rook endgame. So after rook to f8, maybe NEPO will defend the second rank with something like rook to d2, controlling this and controlling this. And he'll just go slowly here, while Hans is also looking for little improvements. Maybe NEPO will try to push this pawn all the way to a5, or just a little bit on a3 to stay at least on the dark square. Depends what is Hans' idea after bishop d7, because he has this one option of, yeah, he actually played rook from f to e8. This natural move. He didn't prefer to put a bishop here because he understood that f3 and e4 plan could be unpleasant for that bishop. That's why he put a bishop back on the e7 square. The instant snapping of the chess pieces is jarring. Please fix it in the next stream. What do you mean by that? What is this? Do you mean the voice of the board? Do you mean that you can hear the board, right? When I make the moves? Let's try to fix it. I think you hear the mouse. It's not the... Maybe they're looking for twinning animation when pieces moves if possible. You want to... I think you want the animation to be more smooth. Okay, let's try to change that. 1 second. Okay. Okay, I think I changed it. Let's refresh the page. Is it better now? Now when I make a move, and when they make a move. Yeah, I think it's better, but now it's slow. Now I turned it slow. Now it's actually very smooth, yeah. So actually NEPO played the move rook to d2. As we already mentioned, this makes a lot of sense because controls the second rank. And this gives the quite nice safety, because in endgames it's always important to control the first rank for the king safety. And the second thing you want to control is also the second rank, because rooks, when the rook comes on the second rank, or the 7th rank, the other side has to be very careful. So that's why NEPO decided to put a rook on d2 and potentially double on any line that he wants. Is it the d line or c line? Depends where he wants to maintain the pressure. So there is another thing that you should know about the endgame and the middle game difference when it comes to the rook placement. Many people were talking that grandmasters are grandmaster because they usually also know what is the best placement for the rook. And you can become a very good player and you can improve a lot of your game if you just know where your rook belongs, because where your rook belongs, that's actually the hardest thing to decide in the middle game. Like, how many times happens in the game that you place the rook on one square and then immediately after a few moves you regret the rook placement. Oh, I should put the rook on the other spot. So that's why you should know where the rook belongs. And I believe that in the middle game, when you have queens on the board, your rook wants to stay as close as possible on the closest possible line versus their king. It means if the king is on g8, then you want to control the d line. For the HANS, that's why HANS put the rook on the e line, because he wants to be as close as possible to the white's king. He could play on the b line, but this is not about the king side attack, it's about just controlling the b line. He's not wasting the time, so that's why he puts the rook here. On the other side, NEPO will most probably do rook from c to d1 and then do the same stuff. But on the other side, for the endgame, if we trade the queens here, you want to have the most distance lines for your rooks. It means if it's possible, then both of them wants to reach the b line. In that case, let's just imagine that queens are out of the game. NEPO wants b line, HANS wants b line, because it's the most distance lines from the king, and that's actually where you have the pressure. Otherwise, if NEPO remains with the d line in that endgame, king can stay on e7, and king will himself single-handedly control the e line and not allowing the entrance for the rooks. That's why in the endgame it's very important to go for the most distance line, and for the middle game to be close as possible to the king, so you can provide the tactics. So that's the deal about the rook placement, comparing the lines and comparing the ranks in the endgame segment. I hope you understand that. I don't know the difference, how much people below 1000 elo and people on 2000 understand this. Maybe some of them already know. Very good players also know this stuff, these rules. These are kind of basic rules that some strong players are not even thinking about it. They already know it intuitively. So they don't need to know, they already learn it by experience. So that's why actually in chess there is many people that are so strong players, but on the other side they don't know how to teach, because they just feel the game. They have very good intuition. So technically here we can already see that, yeah, That's exactly. We have some very strong players, but maybe you think, okay, how he's so strong, but he doesn't know how to explain. It's because it's not about like that they don't know the rules. It's about that they just feel the game and they don't have certain sentence to explain some stuff. And in this case, Hans sacrificed the pawn on a7. Taking this pawn is possible, but I believe that Hans wants something like bishop to h3 and to maximally complicate the game here. Maybe just putting the pressure. Actually, there is already very interesting sacrifices on e2, guys. This is actually a very nice move. Because after rook takes e2, queen f3 will happen. If the knight takes, and then this is the point of this. So he wants to sacrifice on e2. If the rook takes, then we might have just taking on d4 and then still opting for queen to f3. So Hans is preparing some tactical stuff. And I like this because preferably we don't want to see George position. That's why actually they're cooking these two games. We've seen in the first game very pressing position from the NEPO. You can check how that game went. It was really fast. At the beginning was really boring because it was famous endgame line. Berlin. Second game was already crazy from the start. Like it was very imbalanced structures in Rosolimo, Sicilian. Now we have English with a rising isolated pawn in the middle and this very open endgame with a bad pawn on c6, but on the other side Hans has a bishop that definitely could help the tactics on the king side and also the controlling stuff about the B and A line on this diagonal. So let's see how this game went because there is many things that could possibly happen here. Like, if rook from c to d1, the move that you will never make here, as black, is something like rook a8. But this is the top engine line, according to this machine, web engine. And this is something, of course, Hans will not play. He'll play something at least like a6, which is more natural. I believe that rook cd1 is a very strong move here. And this is technically explaining my recent statement about you want the closest line next to your pawn and king, because technically speaking, Nepo could choose the B line to control. But then he's completely leaving the king on g1 alone, and these rooks becomes very strong pieces, putting a lot of pressure on e2. And as we already saw, that this is very nice tactic. Bishop to h3, followed by rook takes c2 and queen f3 stuff on g2. This is amazing resource that most probably Hans saw, and he is opting for that. But he is waiting for the right moment. That's why he brought a rook to d8, because now bishop h3 is definitely a move. You can notice the threat of the engine. He wants that move. The red arrows on the screen are the threats that Hans could possibly play in this position. Bishop h3 is the biggest arrow you can notice, and he played it. Queen takes a7 and bishop h3. Guys, we are predicting the Niemann idea. He's looking for that sacrifice on e2 in the future, which provides queen to f3 and then checkmate on e2. But he has to be conscious about that, because if the knight captures and then knight e4 will defend it, but after this sacrifice, knight cannot capture because rook will capture d2. It means that he needs to recapture with the rook, which leaves the knight here, but still gives the open holes and light squares that possibly ruins the king's safety. What do you think about chess? You lose more elo from losing than get elo from winning. Obviously, it's much harder to get elo in chess than to lose. Like, if you want to lose the elo, you can just sign up on the tournament without single practice. You can lose to a bunch of low, underrated kids, right? Just sign up to kids event and you're gonna get crushed. What is the score? Yeah, many people are trying to see the score. Many new people join the stream here, so this is the scoreboard. There is typo in an up segment. It's day 2 actually, not day 1. So the first day went in NEPO's favor, leading by 1 point. We have 6 matches, 6 games until the end of the match. It will be quite exciting, so stay tuned for this weekend and the final day, the Monday, which will decide most probably the winner of this match. Because we don't want to really see that someone is convincingly crushing the other side. We want to see a very exciting match because both players are having different styles. NEPO likes to attack a lot. Niemann is more solid player. And we have clash of styles and generations. So bishop h3 on the board. So let's see now what Engine recommends as a tactical opportunities. He definitely opts for this rook takes c2 tactic or rook takes d4 tactic followed by rook takes c2, but on the other side, as long as the queen is connected with that pawn, with that knight on d4, they can also recapture back by the queen. So Niemann is opting for this type of tactics. He's definitely looking to press on the king side. That's what he wants. On the other side, he just pawned down, and this pawn could be a promoter in the future. This game is already getting quite exciting. What are the time controls for all games? 60 plus 30 increment, 60 plus 30 seconds, without time control after the 40th move. This is the fast classical, right? Yep. This is the new format they're experimenting, already invented by FIDE, and this is the first official match, big elite match with this format. And the next one will be the Total Chess Championship, I believe so, where most probably there is other events, but not the elite events that are implementing this format. Hello, welcome to stream, guys. There's many new viewers. Welcome to stream. Have you ever played fast classical yourself? I did. I actually did. In Ljubljana Chess Festival was not that fast because it was 75 minutes plus 30 seconds. And there was time control after the 40th move, but not 30 minutes. There was 15 minutes. Many people are already complaining that these faster time controls will ruin the quality of chess. But we can eventually say, without any doubts, that more you play chess, more time you spend in the game, eventually you're going to find a move. So even some 2000 players could find very strong moves after thinking for 30 minutes. And that's why it's getting more excited, because when you get a little bit faster time controls, then mistakes or blunders are most possible to happen on the board and more. So I believe, and I'm really fan of this new format. Maybe some people, I actually believe that there is a lot of people, they don't like it, but I think this is a future of chess, and we have to agree that speeding up the game might a little bit ruin the quality of chess, but it will bring more excitement and audience. If you want to popularize the game on the next level, you want to bring more people in chess, because our society is brainwashed by retention, and we can say that speeding up the game might help the bringing more popularity. So yeah, I agree. Should K factor be linked to the time control? Like here in my country, the national rating gets weighted by time control, so 60 minutes would have smaller elo change than 90 minutes. I think K factor should be only higher if you just start chess, not if you're a kid, because we see eventually that many kids under 18, there is this room for FIDE from 2014 July. I remember that I was 13 at that time, and my K was 30, because at that time I just started playing these official events, FIDE-rated tournament, and on 2014 July, 1st July, FIDE changed that every young player under 18 is having 40 coefficient until he crosses the 2300 on the official list of the month, not on the live rating. There was literally kids that were like 20 to 90, and they were crossing 2500 elo margin in 1 month because they played 2-3 tournaments, got 100 or 200 points, and they were jumping from 2200 to 2500 at that time. So this was ridiculous. They invented later that more you play the games in the month, your K is anyway reducing, doesn't matter your scores, it matters the amount of games you played. So it was really crazy. That's why they need a lot of adjustments for the rating, because it's getting quite imbalanced. And okay, we have queen c5 on the board. NEPO is slowly bringing the queen there. Hans thought for quite a lot of time deciding some earlier moves, but now they are even with time. So NEPO also spent some time thinking, I guess. Engines are always saying that position is level, but the problem is practically if Hans waits and doesn't make any progress in this position, then NEPO is remaining with a pass pawn on A, and he might create future trouble. K10 doesn't exist if you didn't cross 2400 elo. So you can't get K10. You can only get K20. K20 and that's it. Coefficient 20 is for all players that are already in the game for some years. For the players that cross 20 elo margin, 2300 margin, that's what I crossed, so my K is 20. For kids are under 18, if they didn't cross 2300, they also have K40. For international masters and grandmasters, K10, and that's it. What was black reply to rook takes c6 instead of queen c5? Somewhere earlier, right? No, here, okay. Rook takes c6. You tell me. It's a blunder. Why this doesn't work? Tactics, guys. There is queen takes c6, knight takes c6, and just rook takes d2, and this is eventually completely lost position because there is no defense from the checkmate, or there is no defense from just exploiting the second rank, and Niemann will win the game. So rook, queen takes c5 is better option, of course. Like simply in the game, you know how I'm gonna recognize that you might blunder something in the game very soon or not. You just check the safety of your pieces. So if you don't want to blunder in the game, keep your pieces organized. It means keep them connected, keep them protected, keep them under control. Currently now, what we see, the big pressure on d4 here from two pieces. Behind that piece is vulnerable piece that is not protected. So d2 rook is not protected by the rook here. If this is doubled on the d line, then that's okay. Like, NEPO will have protection, but he's already having two pieces that are not functional because they are pinned or they are under significant pressure from the opposite side. On the other side, the rook on c1 is also not technically protected, so the rooks are not connected. We have third piece in the game that is not protected. And queen is out of the game. Queen is not handling this stuff in the middle. So that's the reason, mathematically, rook takes c6 is a blunder, because we can just take that guy, and after knight takes the queen, we just win two rooks for the queen. And that's how you also exploit the tactics yourself. On the other side, check the Niemann's pieces. Rooks are connected, queen is safe, bishop is technically not protected, but he's completely out of the game. Like, he's on the edge of the board and he doesn't need protection. He's itself a good piece. But if this bishop would stand on f5, then queen has to stay on f6 for a long time to protect the bishop if Hans wants to keep that bishop there. So chess is actually very simple. You can follow a couple of rules during the game, your game will be already much better. You don't need any crazy stuff. There is no hidden things in chess. It's just a matter of experience and caring about your position. Keep the games natural, keep your pieces protected, and that's it. You're going to have a very safe game. You don't need to know crazy theory, you don't need to know crazy tactics, you just keep your piece organized. Now Hans spent already quite some time, I think 8 minutes on clock, to get something. Maybe he's thinking about some certain ideas here, like rook e4 maybe looks attractive for him because it's putting the pressure here, provoking e3 weaknesses. Simple game. It's simple game for chess players. For new players, maybe not so simple. I play around 15 classical games a year. I never play online. That's a very big mistake. Big mistake, my friend. If you don't have time to play, or if you don't have a chance to play classical games, then at least play online. It will definitely help you. Clock was not paused. It was just when I make the moves here on the main board, it's like you can see the sign, but you have the live board on the right side next to my camera, and on the left side is the analysis board that we have. So technically speaking, from the yesterday we implement these fixes, and I hope everything now seems to be smooth. What controls you would play online? I like blitz. In the last period I played a lot of rapid and classical, so my speed in chess is a bit slow nowadays. I mean, nowadays, this couple of months, let's say. But eventually you always get back, so you just need to speed up your play, because your mind is always checking the stuff, checking the moves, checking ideas. Well, in blitz, the intuition is a big part. You don't have so much time to calculate, you're just, in most of scenarios, relying on intuition. The scoreboard is, again, for the new viewers, NEPO leads from the first day with just 1 point lead. He won very nice first game in a real Paz endgame. And the second game was Rosalimo e6 variation. Quite imbalanced from the fifth move of the game. It's very nice, very hectic game where also NEPO has a very good chances to win that one, but unfortunately for him, HANS got very nice advantage to, not advantage, sorry. He got very nice chance to give the perpetual checks and he take it and leave with a half point for himself. But let's see if HANS can get the first point of this tournament in this game. He's definitely having good chances if NEPO made some mistakes. He's again taking some little risks here. If we see much earlier, there was a good chance for Niemann. We can go all the way back somewhere here, where after bishop e6, bishop takes. HANS was spending here, he spent like 12 minutes to decide what to do, but he has a clear chance of just taking on b3, taking on c6, and propose the queen trade, where after this rook endgame, it will be a very nice finish and the end of the stream. But HANS chooses to go for imbalances, and he took on the c6 with a pawn, where after NEPO was just start consolidating his position, and after a few moves we got bishop on h3 and queen on c5, where HANS has sacrificed the pawn, but there is great chances to exploit the light squares on the king side together with his rooks, putting very nice pressure and getting a lot of attention, because this pawn looks like a pass pawn, but you cannot really push that pawn, and ignoring the little threats that HANS can put and press the king here, because we already see these possible sacrifices, possible patterns of rook takes e2 followed by queen to f3 and then queen to g2, like specifically after rook takes e2, if the knight captures, there is rook takes d2, and if the rook captures, we might have sacrifices and just taking on d4 and then later going queen to f3, which that's the main point why HANS put a bishop here. And for the rest of the game, NEPO will struggle how to organize the position. If we get a queen trade on the board, NEPO has good chances to win the game. That's what he's looking forward. That's why he brought a queen back, trying to consolidate, also bringing to the center, putting the pressure on the c6 pawn also the same way. And on the other side, HANS is fighting to not allow the queen trade. Let's say rook to e5, the move here. Let's put something on the board. What is the move now for NEPO? I'm afraid that NEPO needs to take another pawn here, that he doesn't have time to do anything else, so he needs to keep taking these pawns. And then, is there any sacrifice here? Like, let's say queen takes e6, rook takes e6, and rook takes d4 followed by rook takes e2. Threatening mate and threatening rook takes e2. Okay, technically this is possible to play for HANS, but I think it's not a great idea. He will not go for that, obviously. Maybe rook to c8. Yeah, I think rook to c8 might happen, because if queen takes f6, in chess we have intermezzo moves, guys, so that's why this doesn't work. I believe that NEPO has to sacrifice the queen. Guys, this could happen in game, guys, just to tell you. And king h7. Guys, we might have seen this position. This is quite possible to happen, because after queen c5, if HANS goes for rook e5, he's inviting queen takes e6. Otherwise, if he drops the queen and refuses the trade, if refuses to take the pawn, then rook from e to d5 will happen. And this is a very nice press by Hans Niemann then. On the other side, if he takes on c6, we'll see the rook c8, where after the queen sacrifice, NEPO will have rook and knight and two pawns for the queen, but still, HANS will not refuse to enter this position, because on the end of the day, and especially in time scramble, queen is a queen, and there is more threats that white has to be careful about. But technically speaking, this is, let's say, easier to play with white if you have more time on clock. if they enter pure time scramble, like the bleed segment, then could be questionable for NEPO, because queen and rook are together such a nice combo here. There is no current threats, like maybe NEPO will just bring the rook all the way back. HANS will put a pressure on that knight. Knight could retreat, and of course trading the rooks is not a good idea, so that's why HANS will try to stay with his rook in the game and place it on a5. And HANS decided to go rook to d5, still inviting this move. And I believe that we're gonna see this, but with just different rook placement. Rook will stand already on d5. Trade. Guys, we are seeing the queen sacrifice. NEPO took on c6. Guys, NEPO took very quickly on c6 actually. He didn't spend so much time, and now rook c8 is the only move for HANS here. And queen sacrifice on the board. NEPO sacrificed the queen to get this convenient endgame. This is what we want. This is what we want to see. Complete imbalance, exciting match that these two players are bringing to us from Belgrade in Serbia. King to h7 will happen, or maybe rook to d8, but I don't think that HANS wants to. I don't think that HANS wants this on the main screen and run this board in the middle, so we can see exactly how the game is going. HANS thinks to also bring the rook on d8, but he chooses to play with a king. Guys, don't write in the comments that the footage is really bad, I know. Don't do that, please. We have actually very untypical endgame, where NEPO is looking for the press here. He definitely gets a little comfort moment after playing the move e3. He's not winning technically. He understands that he is more pleasant, but there is a lot of room for Niemann to counterplay if NEPO exposes too much. So we already got a queen sacrifice. We are 1 hour 30 minutes in the stream. HANS played queen to b4, queen to b6. So in these positions, as far as I know, HANS cannot allow this a2 pawn to get on his camp by being protected by two rooks, let's say. Then that will be very tricky for him to handle this pawn, plus to handle the press of two rooks and knight. This knight on d4 is like one of the best pieces. This is the monster. This knight here is the monster. So this knight definitely gets a lot of attention, controlling all central squares, plus the central squares here, and also on the queen side, where actually this pawn gets the support. On the other side, if somehow NEPO managed to bring the rooks behind and this pawn up, this could be quite unpleasant for HANS to defend. This would be almost lost game, because then one piece needs to stay behind that pawn, and this will make this piece permanently passive. On the other side, there is 4 versus 3. If HANS managed to get rid of this pawn on a2, he has very comfort endgame. But just because this pawn is still in the game, HANS has to be careful, and also he is down 20 minutes, while NEPO is 35 minutes on clock. Now we are again in a problem of time management. HANS spent significant time earlier for replying on the move queen c5. He spent here 15 minutes, which was maybe not the best idea. And NEPO is confidently controlling the C line, which I believe doesn't really matter now. I think the best idea for NEPO is to start pushing A2 pawn, if that would be possible for him, but we can see the big counterplay from Niemann. So what Niemann could try here now, and that's actually what I mentioned, he's looking to eliminate a pawn on A2, and this is pretty much what's gonna rise, because there is no defense for that pawn now. Rook to A5, and now how does NEPO defend this pawn? There is no way. The next move we'll see the exchange of rooks, and then we'll have rook knight and pawn for the queen, plus the remaining 3 pawns here against this 3 here. So we're gonna see some simplification here, where definitely Niemann will not lose this position. Let's read a little bit of comments. I completely forgot to hear it, guys. One thing about title players have noticed is you guys are inhumanly quick at puzzle rush. Is there a secret to it? There is no secret. It's just a matter of practice. So eventually I played thousands of games more than you. I've seen thousands of more patterns than you, if you are below 2000 or something. Eventually on the other side, Niemann, for example, or NEPO are more experienced than me. They've seen thousands more patterns than me and thousands more played games than me, and more experience, and that's it. Like, I think experience matters a lot in practice. You have to make yourself uncomfortable, otherwise you cannot find and solve your problems over the board. If you don't solve your problems at home, when you get the problem on the board, you can't solve it. This is a peak advice for, you don't need any GM to tell you that you need to put on work. There is no coach in the world that can magically increase your rating. You have to put on work. H4. I'm 48. I started 5 years ago. 4 years ago I registered to the chess club. It took my year to FIDE ranked, and I just crossed 1800 a few months ago. I play study chess around 1 hour per day. Okay, that's fine. Like, every day solve something. Every day do something. Oh, it's a game over. I didn't even see that. Sorry, guys. Oh, is it a game over? Okay, I'm gonna try to bring the Niemann here. 1 second.
It's just a suggestion. The board always, if HANS sits here, looks at you, you always have the right hand. So the sits there.
I'm left-handed.
And you're right-handed.
Even we both have like, you know, edge factors.
Yeah, so, yeah, so, yeah, so you sit there, HANS sits there, and you always have it on the right hand. So HANS sits there, you sit there, and have the clock on the right hand.
Just like yesterday wasn't the same, I guess.
No, and we left the colours, so we set up to the side. It's okay?
No, but explain me what do you mean?
I mean, if you sit here,
Yeah, okay.
you will always have the clock on your left. You will always like to change the colors. So you put white here, like that. And you put black here, you put black.
No, I mean, but I think like regularly we do. So regularly we make like we just change our places like this. Yeah.
You like chess places?
Yeah. I know. Yeah. Like every match.
4:30, 2:30?
Alright, guys. It's a draw. They agreed on a draw in that very interesting position. Obviously, Hans didn't want to get a risk there, and I believe NEPO for the draw because NEPO doesn't want to risk in that position. Eventually, they agreed very early, unexpectedly, and we finished the stream here. The next game is starting in less than 3 hours, 2:30 Central Europe time. Put your alarms and stay tuned. We'll be there soon.